through making those great causes, you're overcoming any inadvertent bad courses that you make in the course of every day. So it's nothing to be scared about. Nothing important to understand. This is part of the mechanics of life. We can't help it. But the important thing is to know, of course, when we're doing it, and to be able to chant Daimoku to offset that. This is the crucial thing. Turn poison into good medicine that way. So I hope everyone understands now, if they didn't understand before, that there is something called, rather not terribly well described as punishment, because it sounds as if you're being punished by God or someone. In fact, of course, you're punishing yourself. In Japan, in Japanese, it's called bachi, which is a nice word. It's sort of got a ring to it, hasn't it? So anyway, there is bachi and benefit. And life is one or the other at every second and moment of our lives. So with that in our minds, let's stop and have the coffee break. Okay? Thank you very much. I forgot to say at the beginning, we're only dealing with part one today. If I felt, really studying it all, that if we all understand part one, then we can understand part two. So I leave it to you to really read through part two before you've forgotten everything that's been said about part one. And I'm sure the whole thing will then become clear to you. So the one point that I wanted to mention before we go on is that it may sound rather as if Mr. Tota is taking the mickey out of Shakyamuni when he said, about halfway through that passage, those people who oppose the theory of punishment are no different from those who are seduced by the superficial compassion of Shakyamuni's Buddhism. I say they do not embody the true spirit of Nichiren Shoshu. What he means by that is, when he says superficial compassion of Shakyamuni's Buddhism is in relation to the nature of Nichiren Daishonin's Buddhism. So Shakyamuni's Buddhism is known often as the Buddhism of the harvest. That is to say, people over many eons of time followed a sort of snakes and ladder course, sometimes making a mess of things and slandering and going backwards and sometimes going forward. But in the end, they managed to be born with Shakyamuni or in the period after his death for about 500 years or so. And it's called the Buddhism of the harvest because they had to make all those causes over that many lifetimes in order to get there. And Shakyamuni's Buddhism, as you probably know, was quite complex, a very lengthy and difficult practice involving many, many precepts and so on, which had to be followed. So the only people who could practice Shakyamuni's Buddhism fully were monks who were giving up their lives to do so, and people who were fortunate enough to be born in rich families who didn't have to toil in the fields and were able to give up their time totally to practicing. So that was the Buddhism of the harvest, whereas Nichiren Daishonin's Buddhism, which he fought to establish over finding his way through endless persecutions, offers Buddhahood to people, anyone, in one lifetime. In other words, we are practicing in this lifetime to attain enlightenment ourselves. So this is what Nichiren Daishonin promises. So therefore, purely in terms of compassion of the teachings of Nichiren Daishonin is greater because it offers Buddhism to all. Of course, in fact, it's a question of the time. Shakyamuni's time he was starting and introducing Buddhism. Whereas Nichiren Daishonin's time, he praised Shakyamuni continuously because he prepared the way for him to teach the great pure law of Nam-myoho Renge Kyo. Is that clear to everybody? So it's a relative matter of compassion is what he's talking about. Good. So let's read on now.
So it's the bottom of page 2. Second one.
Yes, please.
Meanwhile, the Japanese government, in the midst of World War II, had plunged the whole nation into the abyss of war. Firmly embracing Nichiren Daishonin's spirit during wartime, President Makiguchi resisted the government order to worship the sun goddess of Shintoism, an evil policy that permeated the nation. The military government of the time must have been deceived by the misconception that the sun goddess had generated the kamikaze, sacred wind, that helped push back the Mongolian invasions in the 13th century. The government was unaware of the fact that the kamikaze arose from the prayer of the true Buddha, Nichiren Daishonin. The military government neither heeded nor referenced Nichiren Daishonin's teachings, failing to recognize that, because of his slanderous acts, Japan was attacked by Mongol forces. The Japanese military government employed the base, evil philosophy of Shintoism to unify the nation's spirit, whereas the United States followed the philosophy of pragmatism as represented by the American philosopher John Dewey. This, along with the lack of materials, had already determined the outcome of the war. It was unavoidable that the military authorities went insane as the nation experienced a total defeat. The supreme philosophy of Buddhism clearly explained that Japan would be defeated if it operated based on Shintoism. In fact, the military even attempted to burn those of the Daishonin's documents that expounded his most important teachings. The military held the reins of authority. It was like a knife in the hands of a crazy person. Intimidated and virtually scared to death by the military government, people foolishly agreed to build shrines to the sun goddess in their homes, which they worshipped blindly. In these circumstances, President Makiguchi strictly pointed out to the Soka Gakkai members that worshipping the sun goddess is absolutely opposed to the spirit of Nichiren Shoshu's doctrines. Swayed by the military, the Japanese nation took strange actions. Without understanding how ideologically confused the people would become, the Japanese nation attempted to unify all religions. It went so far as to encourage all citizens to worship the sun goddess and ask her to unleash kamikaze. Those who refused were accused of being enemies of the nation and proponents of treacherous anti-war thoughts. For the first time in the history of Japan, virtually the entire nation adopted faith in the sun goddess. The correct definition of the sun goddess is a deity that protects the Lotus Sutra. In other words, only when we pray to the Lotus Sutra will the sun goddess reveal her power. However, the whole nation, ignorant of the importance of worshipping the Lotus Sutra of Nichiren Daishonin, merely offered prayers to the sun goddess. As a result, devils, rather than the answer to people's prayers, dwelt in the talisman of the sun goddess, and the nation virtually became psychotic. Nikko Shonin, founder of Daisakiji, states in his 26 admonitions, "Believers shall not visit heretical shrines." In this spirit, President Makiguchi made a strong declaration. We have no choice but to propagate the Daigahanzen, the true intent of Nichiren Daishonin, in order to save our nation. How can we save our country merely by praying to the sun goddess?
Thank you. So let's pause there. I've already explained that in the view of the high priests of Nichiren Shoshu, and certainly in the view of Mr. Toda, the appearance of the Soka Gakkai at the end of World War II, arising out of its ashes, as it were, was the great benefit following the slander of more than nearly 700 years of the Japanese people against Nichiren Daishonin and his teachings. And the effect of this was, of course, to lower the life force and the wisdom of the nation. So you'll have, during this course, a lecture on the Risho Ankokuron, which will be an important sequence from this particular guidance here. So very briefly, the theory which Nichiren Daishonin expounds in writing the Risho Ankokuron and presenting it, which he did to the most powerful man of Japan, was that it was wrong religion, which was in fact sapping the life force of the people. And as a result of that, the benevolent forces of the universe, or Shoten Zenjin, as we call them, Buddhist gods, were leaving the land. At that particular time, as you know, in Nichiren Daishonin's lifetime, there were fearful disasters one after another in Japan. Everything you can think of in terms of major disasters, such as epidemics, typhoons, earthquakes, droughts, floods, one after the other over a period of about 46 years. And this, Nichiren Daishonin said, was because the benevolent forces of the universe had left the nation. And the main religion was Nembutsu, which taught that if you chant Namamita Butsu, in other words, devotion to the Buddha Amida, then though you could do nothing about your lot in this lifetime, after you died, you could go to paradise, or, as it was called, Great Pure Land. In other words, this led to apathy. And apathy, of course, means also no life force. So we are taught by Nichiren Daishonin's Buddhism that we feed our life force to the benevolent forces of the universe, which in turn protect this land and its people. This is the way things work. So the purpose of the first prayer of Gongyo, therefore, is to re-establish our connection with those benevolent forces and make sure that our Ichinen and our life force through our Daimoku reaches those natural forces. So it's interesting in terms of what we were saying earlier, that of course the Shoten Zenjin, the benevolent forces, like everything else in the entire universe, has both negative and positive working within it, within them. And it is the positive force of the human being that can reinforce the positive force in the forces which, unseen, surround us on this planet. This is through the principle, of course, of Eshofuni, inseparability of ourselves and everything else in our environment, including those forces. So, I mean, a simple example which shows this very clearly is that if you're stupid enough, or because you're lazy, you go out and lie in the sun too long, it can eventually cause dehydration. And if you went on lying there, it would kill you. Whereas the sun, in its positive way, is a great benevolent force, isn't it? Which enables us to grow wonderful crops and food and so on. And indeed, the sun is very healthy too for our bodies if we don't overdo it. So this gives you an example of how what is within the human being has a deep and profound effect on the way those forces react with us. So clearly here in this, Mr. Toto is pointing out that lesson from the Risho Ankokuron, which I won't dwell on further because you'll have a lecture on it. And he says, furthermore, that the nation virtually became psychotic. So it was as if, in other words, the whole nation had its head broken into 7 pieces. In other words, no longer were people able, or many people, of course not all, but many people were unable to think in a logical, rational, reasonable way. And it led to such phenomena as, for instance, the kamikaze pilot, who would fly their planes like a sort of living torpedo into a battleship and kill themselves in the process. or the fact that until the last year of the war anyway, no Japanese was ever taken prisoner. Because even though they might be wounded and lying on the battlefield, they held a hand grenade ready. And if they were approached by anyone, they blew themselves up together with the person who was probably coming to try and save their lives. And it also explains the really appalling cruelty that was evident amongst the Japanese soldiers who sort of obsessed with this hatred, I suppose, for the enemy, committed appalling atrocities. As you may know, the Young Men's Division of Japan has published more than 40 volumes over the last many years of experiences of these men who served during the war. And looking back at the courage to describe their appalling behavior, which was worse than animals. So all these things Mr. Toda is viewing from the viewpoint of Nichiren Daishonin's teachings. The nation had gone psychotic after the fruit, if you like, the bad fruit of hundreds of years of slander and persecution of those who followed Nichiren Daishonin's teachings, and their heads broken into 7 pieces, well and truly. Okay, here you go.
The head temple feared persecution if it supported Mr. Makiguchi's contention that unless they follow the teachings of Nichiren Daishonin and Nikko Shonin, any country, family, or individual would experience punishment. It seemed that the head temple was more frightened of the possible persecution it would face from the military if believers did not obediently enshrine the Shinto object of worship. In June 1943, Soka Gakkai leaders were ordered to the head temple. The Reverend Jikaio Watanabe, on behalf of Nichiren Shoshu, suggested that the Gakkai members receive the Shinto talisman in the meantime and follow the direction of the military for a while. This suggestion was made with the current and retired high priest on hand as witnesses. Again, Nikko Shonin states in his 26 admonitions that we should not follow even the high priest if he takes actions that oppose the teachings of true Buddhism. In this spirit, President Makiguchi resolutely rejected the idea of accepting the Shinto talisman and left the head temple. On the way home, he said to me, "What I lament is not that one sect will be ruined, but that our nation will perish. I am afraid the Daishonin is indeed sorrowful about this plight. Isn't this a time to admonish the entire nation? I don't know what the head temple is afraid of." We should take to heart the strictness of the Daishonin's golden teachings without fearing authority. President Makiguchi had such vehement spirit. Nevertheless, the Wok military government treated him like a criminal, even though he had committed no crime. 21 Soka Gakkai leaders were imprisoned solely because they refused to enshrine talismans of the sun goddess. At that time, many believers and priests at the head temple were shocked and at a loss as to what to do. When I heard about this, I was ashamed of them. President Makiguchi, myself, and other followers were barred from visiting the head temple, and the whole country criticized their families as being enemies of the nation. Those were very strange days.
So one can sort of visualize what desperate, difficult times they were. But I'm sure in Mr. Makiguchi's and Mr. Toda's mind often must have been the contrast between what was happening and the fact that the head temple gave in to these pressures as compared with those peasant farmers at the time of Nichiren Daishonin, the farmers of Atsuhara, who, although they'd only practiced, we know, 2 to 3 years, steadfastly never gave in to the persecution of the ruling authorities in Japan at that time. And as you know, 3 of them in the end were beheaded because they refused to give up their faith. So there's a great contrast between what those simple farmers did for the sake of their faith as compared to what was happening in Japan at that time. Okay?
Those who were imprisoned had to face a pitiable reality. Many suffered bankruptcy in their businesses. Many were chased after by creditors, and still many others lost their source of income and barely survived. Their families also fell into an abyss of sorrow, discarding their faith and doubting Nichiren Daishonin's teachings because they had had little confidence in their practice and the study of the Daishonin's teachings was shallow. Many who were in prison gradually began to bend in faith. How cowardly they were. They had little courage or depth of faith, and sadly enough, they didn't recognize the Daishonin as the true Buddha. Persecution of imprisonment was very honorable. It was noble in the eyes of the true Buddha. Being persecuted because of our faith put us in an honored position in light of Buddhism. Yet, the many who failed to perceive that they were actually showered with honor discarded their faith. 19 out of 21 of Makiguchi's followers turned away from the faith in the Gohanzen, including such senior leaders as Tatsuji Nojima. Yeah. Shall I read all the names out?
Yes.
Tatsuji Nojima.
No, don't worry about it. I think we'll leave the names up.
Thank you, dear. I appreciate it. Only President Tsuneburo Makiguchi, General Director Josa Toda, and Director Shuichi Jajima remained stalwart in their faith. How difficult it is to continue to believe in the true law. President Makiguchi died in prison of malnutrition on November the 18th, 1944, never losing pride in standing up to persecution. I didn't know of the death of my mentor, Mr. Makiguchi, for a while. I last saw him in autumn of 1943 at the police station where we were being processed as prisoners. After that, we were jailed separately in tiny individual cells. We had been master and disciple since I was 20. Our relationship was even deeper than that between parent and child. Every day in the cell I prayed, Daigo Honzen, I am still young, but my master is old. He is 75. Please give me all his suffering and let my master leave prison as soon as possible. President Makiguchi must have sinned profoundly, slandering the Lotus Sutra in his previous lifetimes. The decree of the Buddha was very strict on him. On January 8, 1945, 1.5 years after my imprisonment began, I was told Mr. Makiguchi had recently died. When I returned to my cell, I could not stop my tears.
So it may look there as if he's almost saying something critical about his master, Mr. Makiguchi, when he says, must have sinned profoundly. But again, it's this very straightforward understanding which both Mr. Toda and Mr. Makiguchi had about punishment. That there was punishment, as the alternative to benefit, one or the other. And he straightforwardly says Mr. Makiguchi must have slandered seriously and badly in previous lifetimes for him to have such a difficult role, causing so much suffering in this lifetime. But at the same time, of course, he is praising Mr. Makiguchi because through his incredible stand against the authorities and against all the weight of the priesthood, he would be changing that unhappy karma forever. This was why he could speak so straightforwardly about it. So, Mr. Makiguchi, there can be no doubt, totally changed his karma through the courageous act which he did. So now I'm going to leave out a bit, and we'll go on. How many paragraphs ahead? Wait a minute. Where did we end, Donnie?
Just here, I could not stop my tears.
That's right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5, 6, 7. 7 paragraphs ahead. I waited patiently for the right time to commence propagation of the great law. Have you all got it? 7 paragraphs ahead. Well, it's actually probably the 8th paragraph.
I waited patiently for the right time.
Yes. Have you all got it? I waited patiently for the right time to commence. All right. Okay, off we go.
I waited patiently for the right time to commence propagation of the great law. First of all, I expounded the philosophy of the Lotus Sutra. I found out later that this attempt was very slanderous, yet it was my first step to reconstruct the Soka Gakkai.
So this is where Mr. Toda honestly confesses 2 great mistakes that he made. The first one was that during his imprisonment, he had, in a sense, been forced to read the Lotus Sutra because he asked for a novel or a book to read, and the jailer brought him the book of the Lotus Sutra, which he'd never read. And he sent it back and said, that's not the sort of book I want. And probably wanted a detective story or something like that to take his mind off his imprisonment. And the book, he asked for another one, and the same book came back. Seemed to me the only book they had in the jail. And in the end, he realized, because it kept on coming back to him, that he really had to read it. And there was something important in doing so. So, as you may know, he read it and came to many realizations as to the meaning of the Lotus Sutra. And in particular, through a reading about the treasure tower and the ceremony in the air, he came to a great realization himself that he was, in fact, he must be, because of his situation and what had happened to him, a bodhisattva of the earth. And therefore, he realized that when he came out of prison, he must do all he can to spread the teachings of Nichiren Daishonin wherever he could. As it happened, of course, after World War II, the Shoten Zenjin worked towards that. The Buddhist gods worked towards it because they established a new constitution in Japan which incorporated absolute freedom of worship and freedom of propagation of religion, which had never fully existed in Japan before. And so he was able to commence the mission of the Soka Gakkai. So, when he went to when he began to shakubuku people and gathered a group of members round him who were new to Nichiren Daishonin's Buddhism, the subject which he knew best, I guess, was the Lotus Sutra. And so he concentrated on teaching them that. But eventually, as he saw everything in his own life deteriorating, rather than progressing in his personal life, in his business and so on, he began to think that something was wrong somewhere. And taking responsibility, of course, as the leader of the movement at that time, he was deeply concerned about it. And he went to the head temple, and he spent the whole of one night chanting and praying in front of the building where the Daigo Honzen was at that time, a small building called the Treasure House, which still exists at the head temple. And on the hard paving stone, he chanted continuously throughout a whole night until dawn. And during that time, he realized that whereas the Lotus Sutra was right for Shakyamuni's time, in this age, the Lotus Sutra is the 7 characters of Nam-myoho Renge Kyo. So he then changed his whole process and rather began to teach them all he could about Nichiren Daishonin's teachings. But, of course, he was hampered there with no gosho. And this, no doubt, was one of the things that inspired him to tackle the problem of producing and publishing the gosho so that it was available for everybody. So that was his first mistake. On you go, Donnie.
Okay. Around February and March 1946, Gakkai members began to appear one by one, including Ms. Yasu Kashiwabara, Mrs. Miyo Izumi, Mr. Shuhei Yajima, Mr. Koji Harashima, Mr. Takashi Kosumi, and Mr. Takasha Tsuji.
I mentioned there the insert in the last bulletin of the plea made by the great pioneer leaders of more than 50 years' practice made to the head temple. And 2 of the names are here, Miss Kashiwabara and Mr. Tsuji. And also, I think Mrs. Miyo Izumi is the wife of Vice President Izumi, who together with the other 3, Mr. Shiraki, Mr. Tsuji, and Ms. Kashiwabara, made this very strong and very moving plea to the priesthood. All right, Donnie.
Okay. I re-educated them about the doctrines of Nichiren Shoshu and the great powers of the law and the Buddha within the Daigo Honzen. I also taught them the importance of having strong and correct faith so that they would never stop practicing under difficult circumstances. I also opened their eyes to the fact that Shakubuku is the rule of Nichiren Daishonin. In autumn 1946, reconstruction of the Soka Gakkai was just underway, but we didn't yet have enough capable leaders. Their faith was still weak, and their understanding of the Daishonin's teachings was still shallow. In no way were we ready to hold aloft the great banner of Kozen Rufu throughout Japan. Therefore, I made it my priority to train members in the practice of shakubuku. But the way they did shakubuku, which was usually to simply bring guests to the temple, was not convincing. This is exactly what I pointed out at the Soka Gakkai's fourth general meeting. I now quote what I said at that time, and through my speech you can see the strong confidence that must yet grow in the Soka Gakkai.
So this speech, I feel, is very important because it lays down, really, the principles on which the Soka Gakkai is based and has always continued to be based to this very day. Okay?
Nichiren Shoshu is a religion that has been embracing the teachings of Nichiren Daishonin correctly for 600 some years, from high priest to high priest. Nichiren Shoshu upholds true Buddhism. This Buddhism is capable of leading us to true happiness. We have experienced this day and night through our practice. No matter how culture may have developed in the world, as long as frictions or power struggles exist among nations completely disregarding morality, humanity can never experience true happiness. If, unfortunately, a war breaks out involving the use of atomic bombs, the human race has no choice but to proceed to destruction. I am convinced, however, that Japan has been given by Nichiren Daishonin a great religion that can halt the destruction of humanity. As we recite during our silent prayers, Nichiren Daishonin possesses the three virtues of sovereign, teacher, and parent. It is indeed an honor that we, of little virtue, can worship him. We are the Daishonin's subjects, children, and disciples. Nichiren Daishonin is the Buddha of the universe, and to be his subjects, children, and disciples is our great karmic relationship. Nichiren Daishonin appeared to enable us to reveal our Buddhahood, also to show us of what Buddha's wisdom is, and thus help us to attain enlightenment. The Daishonin made his advent to allow us ignorant and evil-minded individuals to worship the Daigo Hanzen. Therefore, it is our supreme benefit to be able to follow the Daishonin's teachings and worship the supreme Daigo Hanzen as its child, disciple, and subject. We thus have a mission to share the benefits of the Gohanzen with people in suffering, because we are the first to know of its greatness and of our great karma. We must worship it ourselves and also strive to help others do the same. Whatever may happen to society, good or bad, we have to dedicate ourselves to praying to the Gohanzen and helping others do the same for their happiness. We are just like a rickshaw carrying the ignorant to the Gohanzen. The Gakkai's sole mission is to carry those in confusion to the Daigo Hanzen. The Gohanzen is just like the treasure mountain. It is up to each individual as to how much treasure they can obtain there. In any case, it is the noble mission of the Soka Gakkai to guide the people to the treasure mountain of the Daigo Hanzen. We neither seek honor through religion, nor do we intend to make money with religion, like other newly born religious enterprises. It is indeed a shame if we concern ourselves only with immediate benefits and remain ignorant of the true benefits of the Gohanzen. Recently, some 100 guidance staff were appointed in the Soka Gakkai. It is my great pleasure to advance toward Kozen Rufu together with them. As I mentioned at that time, Gakkai activities in those days were undeniably not vigorous enough. However, Japan had been destroyed as a nation, and the Japanese people were in the depths of suffering. The Gakkai naturally had to arise.
So this speech clearly refers to the fact that the members of the Gakkai who are chanting Nam-myoho Renge-kyo are bodhisattvas of the earth and children, in that sense, of the Buddha. And therefore, the mission of the Gakkai is to spread the teachings, not only for oneself, but also for others. Jigyo and Keita, practice for oneself and practice for others. And it is also the prime purpose of the whole of the Gakkai to achieve or start the movement for Kozen Rufu and never allow its flow to cease, as we are taught from the Lotus Sutra and also in the Gosho. So this is the prime reason, if you like, for Soka Gakkai's existence. And in that respect, it's worth remembering that another point which Mr. Toda had dealt with in those very early days was to establish the Soka Gakkai as a separate legal entity from the head temple. The reason he did this, and it was done again in close consultation with the high priest, was that it was essential for the high priest to be separate in a legal sense, so that if there was an attack on the priesthood, they would be in a better position to protect them if they were not legally actually bound to them, in terms of the civil law, that is. And likewise, if the priesthood felt that things were going wrong in the Gakkai, or if the Gakkai itself was attacked, then the head temple would be legally not involved. And this was finally agreed to be the best way in which the Gakkai could operate. So to this day, they are a separate legal entity from the head temple. And therefore, of course, when there's trouble, they can stand back and carry out activities and respond to any persecution in the best way possible to preserve the teachings and continue to spread the movement for Kosen Rufu. Right, so we read on.
When the Soka Gakkai began its reconstruction, the Rissho Kosekai, a heretical new religion, was also a small organization barely surviving in war-ravaged Japan. This we knew well. However, 7 years later, the Rissho Kosekai had grown into a gigantic organization disseminating its heretical teachings far and wide in society. I asked myself who was to blame for this reality, that is, for allowing a heretical religion to grow so rapidly, while we are the ones who embrace the true Buddhism of Nichiren Daishonin. I had no choice but to answer to myself, the person who leads the Soka Gakkai is to blame. I deeply believed I was spreading Nichiren Daishonin's teachings, yet I used the Lotus Sutra expounded by Shakyamuni as a reference material. I made two mistakes that the true Buddha could not tolerate. As a result, I had to face severe difficulties. In other words, because I failed to stand up when I should have, because I didn't take the position of Soka Gakkai president that I should have, and because I dabbled in Shakyamuni's Lotus Sutra, I had to undergo the punishment bestowed upon me as a slanderous person. Fortunately, however, instead of falling into the hell of incessant suffering and death, thanks to the compassion of the Gohanzen, I realized what to do from then on. Because I was in torment at the time, I gave the position of General Director to Mr. Shuhei Zajima. I then courageously plunged into my own worries. I felt deeply grateful for Nichiren Daishonin's words when I awakened to the principle of lessening karmic retribution. With tears in my heart, I was also deeply appreciative of a Gosha passage from Letter to the Brothers, in which the Daishonin explained the rise of San Soshima in the course of practicing faith. It reads in part, the doctrine of Ichinen Sansen revealed in the 5th volume of the Makashikin is especially profound. If you propagate it, devils will arise without fail. Were it not for these, there would be no way of knowing that this is the true teaching. One passage from the same volume reads, as practice progresses and understanding grows, the 3 obstacles and 4 devils emerge vying with one another to interfere. You should be neither influenced nor frightened by them. If you fall under their influence, you will be led into the path of evil. If you are frightened by them, you will be prevented from practicing true Buddhism. This quotation not only applies to Nichiren, but also as a guide for his disciples. Reverently make this teaching your own and transmit it as an axiom of faith for future generations. I was very fortunate to experience these 2 Buddhist principles. Recently, when I was walking down the street, I clearly saw the eternal truth of the Honkikuden passage. The entire magnificent assembly at Eagle Peak has yet to be adjourned in the depths of my being. I was overjoyed. I resolved to stand up for Kosen Rufu as soon as I could show proof of victory in my life.
So, firstly, he talks about his second mistake, which was to take so long to decide to be president. He even went to the extent of training, I think first 1, then 2, then 3 people who he thought would be suitable as president. But in one way or another, they were unable to stand up and accept such a post. Their faith proved not to be quite strong enough. Meanwhile, time was passing. So it took him 3 years, in fact, before he finally agreed to become president. And he says elsewhere in this that he lacked the confidence to take on such an awesome role. And interestingly enough, President Ikeda also took nearly 3 years to accept the presidency. And it wasn't until the high priest went to see him personally and said to him, "You really must do it," that he actually agreed to take it on. So, of course, it is an awesome role when you think about it, because they take the whole responsibility for the movement, for Kosan of the world, on their shoulders. And it's an immense responsibility. And it's quite natural for anyone to feel that it was too much for them, that they weren't equipped to do it. They weren't strong enough in faith to do it, and so on. So I guess many of you have encountered this already. When someone said to you, "We want you to be group leader or district leader or chapter leader or headquarters leader," always there's that part of one's life, most of the time, in most people, which says, "Oh my God, it's the last thing I want to do." So, of course, there can be various reasons for it, too. One may be a lack of confidence in one's faith, or the fact that, you're going to have to take up a lot of time in activities. All sorts of different reasons come up. I mean, I know it only too well, because also I had fought against the idea, even before I came to this country, because I sort of felt that when I came, somehow or other, I was going to have to be a senior leader. And maybe that was my conceit. Anyway, that's what I kept on telling myself. You're just a conceited so-and-so. And what makes you think that you will have such role to play? And anyway, the other part of me was also saying, I don't want to do that. That would mean I want to live in a country town. This was me talking to myself. It was Chichester, actually, where I wanted to live. And Mitsuko and I often talk about setting up a little business there and gradually shakabuking a group around us, which maybe might become a district, and leading a lovely sort of pleasant life down there. But in fact, of course, it was to be nothing of the sort. But these thoughts were very, very strong in me. And the biggest thought of all, the most important one, was that I hadn't got the faith to do such a thing if I was intended to do it. And I found on my last visit to the head temple before I permanently came back to this country, I found myself actually chanting Daimoku to the Daigo Honzon, saying, "I can't do it, I don't want to do it," etc., etc., etc. And then there was a sort of explosion in my life, because it was like a thunderous, great, not voice, but feeling inside me, saying, it was like a voice, a huge voice, saying, "What are you doing sitting there thinking all these things, What is that for?" Pointing, I felt, to the Daigo Honzon. And I woke up at the start of this great explosion and realized what an awful, slanderous thing it was I was doing. And he said to Mitsuko afterwards, my wife, if it hadn't been the chair I had a back to it, I would have gone over backwards. The explosion of this was so colossal. So it didn't entirely cure me. I still had these feelings that I didn't want to do it and that I wouldn't be capable of